Okay, so we are back here today to talk about the ocean as a habitat. So obviously we need to talk about some oceanography because we can't talk about the marine organisms that live in the ocean without really understanding the environment, the habitat itself. So one of the main reasons that marine biology is offered as a science course, even though we live here in Arizona, right? Not anywhere near the ocean, is for the simple fact that the world, the planet, is really a water planet. When you look at the world, the ocean covers 71% of the planet. And so that's a huge chunk. The majority of the earth, right, is covered, the majority of the earth's surface is covered by water. And as you probably already know, it's vastly important in terms of what happens on land. So what happens out in the oceans will impact us greatly on land. And so when we talk about the oceans, they're divided into four major ocean basins. So here, let me see if I can get my pointer back here. I'm going to get my laser pointer here. So here, if you look, oh, no, it didn't give me my laser pointer. I apologize. Hold on here. So when you look at the ocean basins, and this will be important for you to know for the map test, just as a heads up. So I do want you to know for the map test, the major ocean basins, and then we'll talk about some of the seas and things that you need to know as well. So the Pacific Ocean is here. Here's the Pacific. Atlantic is here. Indian Ocean here. And then the Arctic Ocean is here. So you may say, well, what about, down here? And you may have heard this referenced as the Southern Ocean. And that's because it's kind of this continuous body of water that flows around Antarctica. But because it's supplied by all of four of the ocean basins, the Pacific, the Atlantic, and the Indian, well, the three of these ocean basins, it's referred to as the Southern Ocean, but it's not considered its own ocean basin per se. So sorry about that. It's supplied by these three ocean basins. So, but as you probably have heard, the Southern Ocean is well known for having very rough waters. So this is kind of nice because you can see, top or bottom looking, looking up from the bottom here, you can see the Southern Ocean and Antarctica there. And then a top view looking down, you've got the Arctic Ocean up here. So just kind of a better view of some of the ocean basins. So again, we're talking about we are a water planet. And the oceans not only cover, again, 71% of the Earth's surface, but it's hugely important to what happens to us on land because it regulates our climate and our atmosphere. And we've all kind of experienced how much the oceans have impacted us, and especially in terms of what happens with climate over the past few years when we've gone through periods of drought or we've gone through periods where we've experienced hurricanes and tropical storms. So what happens again in the oceans drives lots of changes on what happens on land. And again, that's one of the main reasons why we offer marine biology as a general science course for non-majors, because it's important to understand what happens in our oceans, not only because it impacts climate and atmosphere, but also because, as you saw in the first lecture, there's a lot of economical values for the ocean to us as well. So when we look at the oceans cover about 80% of the southern hemisphere and 61% of the northern hemisphere. So when we look at the northern hemisphere, we have more land mass in the northern hemisphere than we do in the southern hemisphere. And the southern hemisphere, again, has more oceanic mass. So this is to help you a little bit with your map test, so I put this in here. But I wanted to talk a little bit about seas, right? So when we talk about seas, the seas are really they're basically seas are part of, right, the ocean. So here up here, the Bering Sea is still considered part of the Pacific Ocean, but it's an area of the Pacific Ocean that's kind of partially protected, right? And in this case, it's kind of partially protected and blocked off by the Aleutian Islands here. So we call this the Bering Sea. So again, these seas are going to be kind of partially enclosed areas, kind of partially protected areas, like the Gulf of Mexico you can see here is protected by, your Central America and North America here. Caribbean Sea, again, is kind of enclosed by the Caribbean islands, and again, Central America here. So these are these different seas, and we'll talk about some of these seas throughout the semester, which is why we have you do the map test so that you can kind of make these correlations. So we're going to talk a lot about the coral sea when we do coral reefs, obviously, because this is where the Great Barrier Reef is. So again, you can see these will mark these different seas for you: the Arabian Sea, the Persian Gulf, Red Sea, Caspian Sea. So you can use this map to help fill in some of these map points for you. You guys all probably know the Bering Sea, I'm sure, if you've watched The Deadliest Catch, right? Just super important show there. But so when we look at the marine environment as a whole, it becomes very complex and challenging, and that's because we have to look at the oceans in a 3D kind of breakup and classification. So when we classify our marine environments, it's not as simple as we might think, because you have to look at the oceans in this 3D kind of format. So there's a couple different ways that we can look at the oceans. We can kind of look at what happens in areas where light is allowed to enter through. We call that the photic zone. And then in areas where there is no light, and those are areas that we call the aphotic zone. A means without, photic means light, so that literally means without light. And so one of the ways that we can kind of chunk this up here, and again, we kind of call this layering approach stratified. So the ocean is kind of this layered or stratified kind of breakup to it in terms of classification. And so when we talk about the photic zone, where we're getting light, the area where we get the most light, the most exposure to light, and the area that is exposed to the surface here is called the epipelagic layer. And that epipelagic layer is going to be important. We're going to talk a lot about that epipelagic layer because that's the most diverse in terms of life. So we'll discuss that a lot further. Mesopelagic usually goes from, about 100 meters down to about 1,000 meters down. So we call that the mesopelagic. The bathypelagic, we don't usually talk a whole lot about, but it begins kind of your deep sea. There's not much light making it into the bathypelagic. At this point, you are all blue light. You have, we'll talk about what happens with the other wavelengths of light as they've dissipated up in these earlier layers here. And then at about 4,000 meters down, you're into what's called the abyssopelagic. The abyssopelagic is going to be kind of what we consider our deep sea, and it's aphotic. Okay, so that means there's no light down there. So let's see, and when we talk about pelagic in general, I should have kind of explained this. These are all pelagic, epipelagic, mesopelagic, bathypelagic, and abyssopelagic are all kind of classifications of this term here, pelagic. And pelagic typically means offshore open water, okay? And so when we talk about offshore open water areas, we have what are called the neritic areas of the pelagic ocean, and then we have the oceanic. Neritic is typically considered the open water that's closer to the shore, and it lies over the continental shelf, which we'll talk a little bit about coming up here. So this is gonna be your neritic zone here. And then your oceanic, the oceanic realm is really over like kind of deeper water. And so here, what we'll call the continental slope on down to our deeper water, all this water column here is going to be called the oceanic column. If that can kind of make sense. We kind of break down that pelagic. And so anything that is considered subtidal is going to be things that are covered by water. So this is what we call subtidal on the continental shelf. And so it's just anything that's covered by water here. And we'll talk a little bit more about this. We've got what's called the intertidal zone over the continental shelf, and we've got the subtidal. The intertidal zone is this little band right here, and we'll talk a lot about intertidal zones coming up here. And intertidal zones are going to be things that are covered by water for part of the day and then exposed to air. So it's between the high tide mark and the low tide mark. So these are areas that, they might only be exposed to air for like a very short time of the year, but they're still exposed at some point, and that's considered the intertidal zone. So this is between the high tide mark and the low tide mark. And then subtidal, again, is going to be anything here that's going to be covered by water, this continental shelf that's covered by water. Again, we'll kind of go through this a little bit more as we get into the different layers. But what my main purpose of going over this slide now is that I want you to see how many different layers there are in terms of classifying the marine environment. And so it gets a little more complex than we think it is. We also use another term called benthic. Benthic means on the bottom. So anything that lives on the bottom, we'll use the term benthic here. So this is benthic. And so these are just some of the ways that we're going to classify the marine environment, some of the terms that we're going to talk about. So again, get familiar with these. I know your book goes into them, but I wanted to introduce them here, and I will introduce them again later. So now we're going to kind of go backwards. We're going to take a little step back, and we're going to talk a little bit about the origins of the oceans, and we're going to talk a little bit about basically what's happening on the ocean floor first, and then we'll kind of get into more of what's happening in our oceans as a whole. But first, it's important to understand the origins of our oceans and where our oceans came from and what's happening in the oceans and how we got here. So some of the clues to the origins of our oceans originally came from Sir Francis Bacon. He was kind of the first one to note, and you guys probably can see this, you've, I'm sure, heard this many times, but Sir Francis Bacon ended up looking at the continents and going, wow, they look like this big jigsaw puzzle that would have fit together at one point in time. And so, when he started looking into this, over many, many hundreds of years, scientists ended up starting to look at what was happening on each side, and was there a way that they could connect these continents in terms of, looking at things like coal deposits. So we found that there were certain coal deposits that matched on opposite sides of these ocean basins. Also, we looked at things like certain geological features that seem to match up on the opposite side, especially of the Atlantic Ocean here. And then some of the really, really interesting information was when we started to look at some of the fossil data. So looking at some of our biological distributions of, especially in the fossil records of animals. And what we found is that there were fossils that we found only in areas, only in areas that would indicate that these continents at one point in time were together and needed to be together, because we would find certain fossils. Now, this example is a mosasaurus, a certain type of mosasaurus that we found. And we only find it here in this area in South America and in this area in Africa. And that's it. And so this was a big point of evidence to indicate that at some point in time, these continents were connected. And we found it wasn't just this mosasaurus, but there were many different fossil species that we found that kind of connected and helped us put this this puzzle together. So Alfred Wegener proposed the first detailed kind of hypothesis of what we call now continental drift. He came up with this back in 1912, that the continents were at one point in time, over 200 million years ago, all together, and at some point in time around 180 million years ago, this supercontinent that we actually now call Pangea, right, started to break up. And so Wegener was the first one to suggest this, that the continents had all been joined together in this supercontinent. He coined it Pangea, and that somewhere around 180 million years ago, they started to break up. And so at the time, Wegener's hypothesis unfortunately wasn't accepted because he just couldn't explain how the continents would have drifted apart. And it wasn't until the late 1950s that we ended up discovering plate tectonics. And all of a sudden that explained continental drift. So plate tectonics is very simple. And again, I know you've all been through this, but it's just this idea that the Earth's outer crust is this kind of hardened layer, and it's less dense than this more semi-plastic layer below. And that this outer layer, the crust, is actually broken up into these large plates that actually move on this semi-plastic layer below it. So let me go ahead and go back to just my pointer here. So I want to show you, and I do have, I want to make sure that you guys, as you're going through the module, please look at those extra videos that I have, the extra resources at the very bottom of this module page. I usually play these videos in class, but to make these videos a little shorter, I've excluded them. This one I'm going to show you because it's really short, but it's kind of nice because it shows you the breakup of Pangea. You know, about 250 million years ago, we were in this giant supercontinent, and then over time you can see how these continents would have moved apart. Now, we haven't gone into the mechanism of how that happened, but we're going to get into that. So I just thought that was a really quick, cool animation of how that happened. So real quick, again, a review, what is the Earth's crust? So again, remember that the Earth is composed of these kind of three layers. We've got the core, right? This iron-rich core, super dense. And then we have the semi-plastic mantle here, a little less dense, and again, more really liquid. And then this thin outer crust. Okay, and as you move again closer to the core, you get more and more dense. As you move farther out, less and less dense. So the crust is this less dense, kind of thin layer that basically floats atop these semi-liquid portions of the mantle below it. And in the years after World War II, we had sonar, right? Sonar was developed for World War II. I apologize, my dog sometimes is this video, and I can't avoid that. But in the years following World War II, sonar really gave us some of this these detailed images of what the seafloor would look like. And before World War II, we really thought that once you got out into kind of the abyssal plains, that it was just flat open plains, and it was like a desert in the ocean, right? But then when we started to get some of this detailed sonar information, these surveys from sonar, we ended up finding that was not the case at all, and that there were these huge mountain ridges in the ocean. And then there were these huge valleys in the ocean. So the ocean floor, in fact, was not flat at all, but it had these big open plain areas. But amidst these plains, there were these huge underwater mountain ranges, and you can see these here. And then these, again, huge, deep valleys, and we call those trenches now. So I know you are going to do some of this in lab, but you're going to look at all of a sudden, where is a lot of the earthquake activity located? Because we know that's where we have plate movement now, right? With plate tectonics, we know that areas where we have earthquakes are areas where there's plate movement. And so if you look at this, okay, and so here, this is Asia, and this is North America. And you go back here and you look, and here's Asia and here's North America. You're gonna start to see, and it's hard to see here, but if you could try to focus on the Atlantic Ocean, really, look here in the Atlantic Ocean, and then look here in the Atlantic Ocean. And what's interesting is you'll see right down the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, there's quite a bit of earthquake activity. And boom, right down the middle of the Atlantic Ocean is this huge underwater mountain ridge system. And so what we started to find out is here where we have these big valleys. So here I'm going to show you this here in the Pacific Ocean. This is going to correlate with some of our huge trenches here. These underwater valleys, deep valleys, right? And so if we look at that, it seems to correlate with a lot of the earthquake activity. So areas where we see these big deep areas, deep trenches, and then areas where we find these ridges, here we happen to see a lot of earthquake activity. And so scientists started to kind of look at this and say, hey, what's really going on at these underwater features? And what we found was that earthquake activity, again, was highest surrounding our trenches, our deep oceanic trenches, and our ridges. And this happened to support the idea, again, that the crust is divided up into these major plates. And so we can see that here. And so not only did we also find that earthquake activity kind of followed that same pattern, but also volcanic activity seemed to follow this pattern too. So if you look, where we typically find the most volcanic activity is here around our trenches, as well as around some of our ridges. And so again, this supported this idea of plate tectonics. Now the story gets even more interesting when we start to talk about aging the ocean floor. So again, you'll get into this in lab and you'll actually do some calculations, but what we started to do was we did core samples. And as we did core samples through the ocean, there are certain elements that we know that have what's called a half-life. They break down at a very specific rate. And so we can look at these specific elements within our core samples and say, well, how much of this element is there? If there's 100% of that element in the core sample, then, we could say it's brand new. If there's 50%, then, again, it's at a half-life. It's broken down. Half of the material is broken down. And so we have these known half-lives of these elements. And what they did is they took all these elements and they started to look at the percentage of these elements in these core samples. And they could use that to actually tell the age of the ocean floor. And what they found was very interesting. So they found that along these certain areas, we had brand spanking new seafloor. So if you look in the red here, again, this is millions of years old. These colors relate to millions of years old. Red, 0, blue being 180 million years old. And so if you look here, you've got brand spanking new seafloor here, here, and here. And then as you move back from this, then you'll start to see we get a little older and a little older and a little older, until you're hitting like 120 million years old and then 180 million years old. And so up against these land masses, and especially near these trenches, we find that we have the oldest ocean floor. But if we look back and we want to match up what's happening with the age of the ocean floor. So again, I want you to look at the Atlantic here because we'll just focus in on one ocean basin, but you can go back and forth and look at many of these ocean basins. But let's focus in on the Atlantic and what's happening right smack dab in the middle of the Atlantic where there's new ocean floor. And if we go back and look, and sure enough here in the middle of the Atlantic, we find where there's brand spanking new ocean floor, a big giant ridge. So, and you can start to follow this pattern for all of these ridges. So here you can look in the Pacific, and then let's go back here. And sure enough, in the Pacific, you see, again, this big oceanic ridge. So what we started to find is that we found this pattern where new ocean floor was being made at the ridges and older ocean floor was found near the trenches. So again, this really was supporting this idea that these continents were floating on this semi-plastic layer of mantle below. And so here's where we get into, and this goes more into the lab that we're going to go into, but we talk about, does this evidence really support this notion of continental drift? And if it does, what's the actual mechanism and how does this happen? And again, that aging of the seafloor really helped us explain how the ocean floor was broken up. So we could, because we knew that there was new ocean floor being made here at these ridges. And so that helped us to break up this ocean floor into these plates. We also, again, aligned that with our earthquake activity and our volcanic activity. And that's how we ended up delineating these big plates on the Earth's surface. And so again, the Earth's crust is divided up into all these large plates. And we can see that here, they delineate them here, and then it's a little easier, I think, to see here. And so I like this one because this actually shows you what's happening in the ocean. And here you can see as they break up these plates, they show you which areas are the ridges, which we're going to talk about where new seafloor is being made, and which areas are the trenches. So I'm going to go ahead and stop here, and then I'll just pick up, just to shorten these videos a little bit. I want to keep them a little on the shorter end. So I'll usually do 2 videos per every 1 lecture. So we'll go ahead and finish this up in the next video here.